"You can't play here," Michelle said, shooing the black girl off the playground. The girl lowered her eyes and quietly walked away, but a moment later, her father appeared. Tall, confident, with a piercing gaze, he approached Michelle and asked, "Would you like to repeat what you just said to my daughter? What happens next? Share your guesses in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story." The sun shone brightly over the neatly maintained playground, its golden rays highlighting the vibrant colors of the slides, swings, and monkey bars. Laughter and shouts filled the air as children ran in every direction, their sneakers thudding rhythmically against the rubber matting. Parents stood in small groups, chatting over steaming cups of coffee, occasionally glancing at their children to ensure they weren't getting into trouble. Among this lively scene, one small figure stood out, not because of what she was doing, but because of what she wasn't. The little girl sat alone on the edge of the sandbox, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the dirt. Her hair was a cascade of tight black curls, framing a face that was far too solemn for her age. She didn't cry, didn't call for anyone's attention, but the quiet sadness in her eyes was hard to ignore, if anyone had bothered to look. She had tried to join the others earlier. A boy was spinning the merry-go-round as fast as he could, his friends squealing in delight as they held on tight. The girl had hesitated, watching them with hopeful eyes. But when she took a tentative step forward, the boy stopped spinning and shot her a look that froze her in place. "You can't play here," he said bluntly, his tone mimicking the authority of someone much older. The other children didn't object, they simply avoided her gaze, shifting uncomfortably. Dejected, she backed away, retreating to her lonely spot by the sandbox. She knew better than to protest. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wasn't even the first time this week. The reason for her isolation wasn't a mystery to her. She had overheard the whispers before, exchanged between parents who thought she couldn't hear. "We don't want our kids playing with her. She's different." They never said why outright, but the looks they gave her said enough. She knew it was because of her skin, her curls, the fact that she didn't look like the other kids. The other parents occasionally glanced her way, their gazes fleeting and uncomfortable. They weren't cruel, not overtly. They simply pretended she wasn't there, as if ignoring her was better than addressing the real problem. To them, she wasn't a child who needed friends and fun, she was an inconvenience, a complication they didn't want to deal with. For the girl, the playground had become a battlefield, and every day she came here, she lost another piece of her innocence. Still, she returned, clinging to the faint hope that one day, someone might see her for more than just her differences. But as she sat there in the shadow of the slide, the laughter of the other children felt like a wall she couldn't climb. The little girl drew a heart in the dirt with her finger and then quickly erased it, as if the act of hope itself was too painful to leave behind. Michelle leaned against the backrest of the park bench, her arms crossed as she surveyed the playground with an air of silent authority. Her sharp eyes darted from the swings to the climbing frame, assessing the children with the precision of a hawk watching over its territory. She sipped her latte, its heat long faded, more out of habit than desire. This playground was hers, or at least, that's how she saw it. For years, Michelle had positioned herself as the unofficial overseer of the neighborhood. She wasn't elected to this role, of course, but her presence was constant, her voice decisive. She decided which parents were in and which were ignored. She had a knack for organizing bake sales and block parties, all while ensuring they adhered to her unspoken rules of exclusivity. Her gaze settled on the little girl sitting by the sandbox, and her polished demeanor faltered. A flicker of irritation crossed her face as she took in the child's presence. The girl's tight curls and dark complexion stood out against the sea of blonde pigtails and pale faces. Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. She shouldn't be here, Michelle thought, the words forming in her mind with a mix of disdain and frustration. This playground, much like the neighborhood, was supposed to reflect a certain kind of order, her order. The girl, with her quiet solitude and unwelcome presence, disrupted that picture. Michelle had noticed her before, of course. How could she not? The child always seemed out of place, hovering at the edges of the playground as if waiting for an invitation that would never come. The other children didn't play with her, and the parents rarely acknowledged her existence. That was how it should be, Michelle reasoned. After all, she couldn't risk chaos creeping into their neatly controlled bubble. She glanced toward the other parents, hoping for some kind of unspoken agreement. A few of them exchanged uneasy looks but quickly turned back to their conversations. They wouldn't openly support her actions, but they wouldn't stop her either. Their silent complicity was all she needed. Michelle adjusted her scarf, her movements deliberate, as she stood up. The girl was drawing something in the dirt with her finger, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her. With each step Michelle took, her sense of authority grew stronger. She didn't see herself as cruel, just practical. If no one else would enforce the unspoken rules of their community, she would. By the time Michelle reached the sandbox, her face was a mask of polite disapproval. She cleared her throat, and the little girl looked up, her large eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Michelle leaned slightly forward, her voice low but firm. "You can't be here." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. Michelle straightened, expecting compliance. She didn't need to explain herself, her presence alone was justification enough. The girl hesitated, her small fingers brushing the edge of the sandbox. For a moment, it looked as though she might protest, but then she dropped her gaze and stood up. She dusted her hands on her dress, her movements slow and deliberate, as if dragging out the inevitable. Michelle watched her leave, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. Order had been restored. But as the girl walked away, her small frame hunched with quiet defeat, Michelle couldn't quite shake the lingering unease that settled in the pit of her stomach. She dismissed it quickly, shaking her head. It's better this way, she thought, turning her attention back to the playground. After all, she had a community to protect. But as the girl disappeared down the path leading out of the playground, a quiet unease settled over the space. The laughter of the children resumed, but it sounded forced, as though even they could sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Michelle ignored it, choosing instead to focus on the role she believed she had to play. The walk home felt endless. The little girl's small feet dragged against the pavement, the once familiar streets now seeming unwelcoming and cold. Her chest felt heavy, her unspoken hurt simmering beneath the surface. She wanted to cry, to let the tears fall freely, but she held them back, clenching her tiny fists as if to trap the pain inside. When she reached her house, the sight of its white shutters and neat flower beds brought no comfort. She pushed the door open slowly, her movements deliberate, as though delaying the inevitable. The warmth of the home wrapped around her, but it didn't chase away the chill that had settled in her heart. Her father's voice carried from the living room. It was deep and steady, a voice that many in the city respected and admired. He was on the phone, likely discussing city council matters or some pressing issue in the community. She didn't want to interrupt, but the weight of what had happened pressed down on her, too much to bear alone. She stood in the doorway, silent and still, until he noticed her. Her father, a tall man with sharp features softened by a kind smile, looked up from his papers. The moment his eyes met hers, the smile faded. "Sweetheart," he said, concern coloring his tone. He ended the call without hesitation and knelt to her level. "What's wrong?" The girl hesitated, the words caught in her throat. She shifted from foot to foot, her gaze dropping to the polished hardwood floor. Finally, she whispered, "The lady at the playground, she said I can't play there." Her father's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, she said that?" She came up to me and told me to leave," the girl continued, her voice trembling. "She said I can't be there." The father's jaw tightened, his usually calm demeanor cracking ever so slightly. He took a steadying breath, trying to mask the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Did she say why? The girl shook her head, tears finally spilling over. No. She just told me to go. Her father reached out, pulling her into a gentle embrace. He stroked her curls, his touch firm but reassuring. It's okay, he murmured, though his mind raced with thoughts of what had happened. He couldn't ignore the subtle implications in his daughter's story, nor could he dismiss the hurt etched into her face. He held her for a moment longer before pulling back to look into her eyes. Listen to me, he said, his voice steady but laced with determination. You didn't do anything wrong. Understand? That playground is for everyone, including you. No one has the right to tell you otherwise. The girl nodded, but the doubt lingering in her expression made his heart ache. He stood, his expression hardening as he reached for his coat. Come on, he said, holding out his hand. We're going back there. The girl hesitated. But, what if she gets mad again? She won't, he assured her, his voice firm. I promise. As they stepped outside, his grip on her hand tightened slightly. The little girl glanced up at her father, seeing the determination in his eyes. For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the playground. The children's laughter was beginning to fade as some parents started gathering their little ones to head home. The air was still warm, but a faint breeze carried with it a sense of change, though no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. Hand in hand, the little girl and her father walked briskly down the sidewalk toward the playground. Her small steps struggled to keep up with his long, purposeful strides, but his firm grip on her hand gave her a sense of security. His tall frame radiated a quiet power, his expression calm but unyielding. As they approached the playground, the vibrant chatter of the children began to dim, replaced by a growing wave of murmurs. Parents turned to look, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. They recognized him immediately. He wasn't just a father, he was the father, a man whose name carried weight in the city. Michelle sat on her usual bench, her latte long forgotten as she scrolled aimlessly through her phone. At first, she didn't notice the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle hush that rippled through the playground like a gust of wind. But when she looked up and saw him, her stomach dropped. Her confidence, so unshakable just moments ago, began to falter. She recognized him instantly. His face had been on local news, his name in the papers. This was no ordinary man, this was a city councilman, a prominent politician known for his unwavering stance on equality and justice. And he was headed straight for her. The girl's grip tightened around her father's hand as they stepped onto the playground. She glanced nervously at the other children, who had stopped playing to watch. Some parents whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the father and Michelle. Michelle stood, her movements stiff and deliberate. She forced a tight smile, but her composure was already beginning to crack. Her heart pounded as she tried to appear unaffected, though the man's presence was anything but ignorable. He stopped a few feet away from her, his tall frame towering over her. His gaze was calm, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of his silence press down on her. Michelle cleared her throat, desperate to regain control of the situation. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice strained but polite. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his daughter, who clung to his hand, her eyes wary but curious. Then, he turned his gaze back to Michelle. "My daughter tells me," he began, his voice steady and measured, "that you told her she couldn't play here." Michelle's forced smile wavered. "Oh, well, she stammered, glancing around as though hoping someone would come to her rescue. The other parents watched in silence, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. "I'd like to know why," he continued, cutting through her weak attempt at deflection. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that demanded an answer. Michelle's confidence crumbled further under his piercing gaze. Her carefully constructed sense of control over the playground, over her role in the community, was slipping away with every second. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The girl looked up at her father, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and relief. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of validation, a sense that someone was standing up for her in a way she couldn't do for herself. Michelle glanced around at the other parents, searching for a lifeline. But none of them moved to help her. Their faces betrayed no solidarity, only a shared discomfort as they watched the confrontation unfold. "I asked you a question," the father said, his voice calm but unyielding. "What did you say to my daughter, and why did you feel it was appropriate?" Michelle's face flushed, and her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the judgment from the parents who had once followed her lead. Her usual confidence, so strong when she was dealing with a child, was nowhere to be found. "I didn't mean to," she began, but her voice faltered. Her excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. She had no real justification, and she knew it. The father didn't break his gaze, waiting for her to finish. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching across the playground like an unspoken verdict. For Michelle, the moment felt like an eternity. For the girl, it felt like justice finally stepping onto the stage. And for the father, it was just the beginning. Michelle felt the weight of his words settle on her chest, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say that wouldn't make her look worse. The silence that followed his statement was deafening. Even the children, sensing the gravity of the moment, stayed quiet, their games forgotten. I didn't mean to make her feel unwelcome," Michelle finally managed to say, though the words sounded weak and insincere even to her own ears. The father took a step back, his expression unreadable. He glanced down at his daughter, who looked up at him with a mixture of awe and relief. Then he turned back to Michelle, his voice calm but resolute. "Whether you meant to or not," he said, "you did. And you need to think long and hard about why." With that, he took his daughter's hand and turned to leave. The little girl looked over her shoulder once, her gaze meeting Michelle's for a fleeting moment. In that look, Michelle saw not just hurt, but something deeper, disappointment. As they walked away, the murmurs among the parents began to rise, their whispers carrying judgment that Michelle couldn't ignore. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her world shifting around her. The question still echoed in her mind, one she couldn't escape: why? And for the first time, she didn't have an answer. As they walked away, the little girl glanced back once, her expression unreadable. Michelle stood rooted to the spot, her forced smile fading as the whispers among the parents resumed, louder now and filled with a quiet disapproval that she couldn't ignore. Her insincere apologies had bought her nothing but judgment, and for the first time, Michelle felt the cold sting of being the one unwelcome. The news spread faster than Michelle could have imagined. What began as murmurs on the playground quickly escalated, rippling through the tight-knit community and beyond. By the time she arrived at work the next morning, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The usual cheerful greetings from colleagues were replaced with awkward nods and sidelong glances. Conversation seemed to hush as she passed by, and an unfamiliar tension followed her into the office. Michelle settled into her desk, trying to ignore the subtle undercurrent of unease. She focused on her computer screen, but her hands trembled as she clicked through emails. Her thoughts were scattered, the memory of the father's piercing gaze and the little girl's silent disappointment replaying in her mind. It wasn't long before her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, meeting with HR, 10 a.m. Her stomach dropped. She tried to tell herself it was routine, that it had nothing to do with the playground incident. But the sinking feeling in her chest told her otherwise. By the time she entered the HR office, the air felt suffocating. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, was already there, seated at the head of the table. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with a sternness that made her throat tighten. Beside him sat the HR manager, Ms. Patel, her expression unreadable but serious. "Michelle," Mr. Henderson began, his voice steady but cold, "please have a seat." She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "We need to discuss a matter that has come to our attention," he continued, sliding a folder across the table. "It seems there was an incident at a local playground yesterday involving you and a child." Michelle's heart sank. Her face flushed as she glanced at the folder but didn't dare open it. She knew what it contained, a detailed account of her actions, likely with added color from the whispers and judgments of others. I don't see how that's relevant to my work here," Michelle said, her voice defensive but shaky. "It's relevant because your actions have been brought to light in a way that reflects poorly on this company," Mr. Henderson replied sharply. "Several parents in the community have reached out, expressing their concerns. Some are even questioning whether someone with your judgment should be representing us." Michelle's eyes widened. "But that was a personal matter," she protested. "It has nothing to do with my job performance." Ms. Patel spoke for the first time, her tone measured but firm. "Michelle, as an employee of this company, your behavior, on and off the clock, reflects on us. We can't separate your personal actions from your professional role when they have become a matter of public concern." "But I apologized," Michelle insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. It was a misunderstanding." Mr. Henderson's expression hardened. "This isn't just about you, Michelle. It's about the company's reputation. We pride ourselves on inclusivity and respect. What you did directly contradicts those values." Michelle opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She realized there was nothing she could say to undo what had been done. "We've made the decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately," Ms. Patel said, her voice firm but devoid of malice. Michelle's breath hitched. "You're firing me?" "We can't afford this kind of reputation," Mr. Henderson said bluntly. "Our clients expect better from us, and frankly, so do we." The room fell silent. Michelle sat frozen, her mind racing as the weight of their words settled over her. The reality of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. "We'll provide a severance package," Ms. Patel added, sliding a second folder toward her. "Please review the details and return the signed documents by the end of the week." Michelle rose shakily from her seat, clutching the folder as if it were a lifeline. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her as she left the office. The stares from her co-workers followed her as she walked back to her desk, each glance a silent judgment she couldn't escape. Packing up her belongings, Michelle fought to keep her composure. Her mind churned with anger, shame, and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was respected, admired even. But now, all of that had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the echoes of her mistakes. As she exited the building, clutching a cardboard box filled with the remnants of her career, Michelle glanced at her reflection in the glass doors. For the first time, she saw herself not as the confident, authoritative figure she had always believed herself to be, but as someone whose actions had finally caught up with her. The silence in Michelle's home was deafening. The familiar hum of daily life, phone calls, texts, neighborhood chatter, had vanished. The blinds were drawn, casting the once bright living room into shadows, and the air felt heavy with the weight of her isolation. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, its screen lighting up briefly before going dark again. She didn't bother reaching for it. She already knew what the notifications would be: more messages she couldn't bring herself to read, more emails she couldn't answer. The fallout from her actions was no longer confined to whispers or sideways glances, it was a roaring tidal wave that had consumed every part of her life. Michelle had always been proud of her status in the community. She was the go-to organizer for neighborhood events, the friendly face that newcomers relied on to feel included. Her name had been synonymous with reliability and leadership. But now, that same name was muttered in hushed tones, attached to phrases like unforgivable and disgrace. It wasn't just the job she had lost. The carefully curated relationships she had spent years building were crumbling. Parents from the playground no longer greeted her with warm smiles. Instead, they turned away, their faces tight with disapproval. At the grocery store, she caught snippets of whispered conversations, her name, her actions, her downfall. The worst part wasn't the judgment of others. It was the realization that she couldn't hide from herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the little girl's face, her wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at her in confusion and hurt. Every time she tried to justify her actions, the father's calm yet cutting words echoed in her mind. What did you think would happen? She thought back to the playground, to the moment she had told the girl to leave. At the time, it had felt justified, even necessary. But now, in the solitude of her living room, stripped of the confidence and authority she once wielded so easily, she saw it for what it truly was, cruelty masquerading as control. The once pristine image she held of herself had shattered. She was no longer the neighborhood's queen, the admired figure she had spent so long cultivating. Instead, she was a pariah, an example of how far one could fall when prejudice and pride went unchecked. The community had made its stance clear. Invitations to events stopped coming. Parents who once included her in group chats quietly removed her. Even the casual hellos she took for granted had disappeared. Michelle was no longer part of the neighborhood she had once claimed as her own. She tried to busy herself, to distract her mind from the growing void in her life. She cleaned obsessively, scrubbing the kitchen counters until her hands ached, rearranging shelves that didn't need rearranging. But no amount of effort could scrub away the reality of her situation. Late one evening, she stood at the window, looking out at the now empty playground. It was dark, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. For years, she had watched over that space, confident in her role as its unofficial overseer. Now, it felt like a monument to her failure, a stark reminder of the moment her life began to unravel. She thought about the little girl again, wondering if she would ever return to the playground. Michelle had no illusions about making amends, what she had done couldn't be undone. But she couldn't stop herself from hoping that, in time, the girl would find the happiness she had tried to take away. As the days stretched into weeks, Michelle found herself retreating further into her own world. The life she had built, the respect she had commanded, was gone. And for the first time, she understood that it wasn't the community's judgment or her lost status that hurt the most. It was the knowledge that she had been wrong, and that no apology, no excuse, could ever erase the pain she had caused. The playground hummed with the usual symphony of childhood joy, laughter, the rhythmic creak of swings, and the soft thud of running feet. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the air was filled with the unmistakable energy of freedom and play. At the center of it all was the little girl, her curly hair bouncing as she raced another child to the slide. Her laughter rang out, clear and unguarded, as if the weight of the past had finally been lifted. This time, she wasn't sitting on the sidelines. She wasn't hesitant or timid, glancing nervously at the other children. She belonged here, and everyone knew it. Her father stood nearby, leaning casually against a fence, his watchful eyes scanning the playground. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a signal to everyone that she was no longer alone. The other children played with her easily now. There were no whispered warnings from their parents, no subtle glances urging them to avoid her. Instead, she was just another kid on the playground, a climber of jungle gyms, a master of tag, and a champion of the merry-go-round. Parents who had once turned a blind eye to the injustice of the past now smiled at her warmly, their guilt subtly woven into their kindness. Some even exchanged pleasantries with her father, though the conversations were tinged with the knowledge that he had been the catalyst for this change. The playground itself seemed transformed, not just physically but in spirit. It no longer felt like a guarded enclave for a select few. It had become what it was always meant to be, a place for all children to laugh, play, and grow. The little girl climbed to the top of the slide, her small frame silhouetted against the sun. She raised her arms in triumph, grinning from ear to ear, before sliding down with a squeal of delight. Her father clapped softly, his pride evident in the warm smile that lit up his face. For the neighborhood, this moment wasn't just about the girl's newfound confidence. It was a lesson, a reminder of how deeply prejudice could harm and how resilience and justice could heal. The parents who had once stood by in silence now vowed to do better, to teach their children that every person deserved kindness and respect. As the girl ran to her father, her laughter blending with the sounds of the playground, it was clear that she had reclaimed something more than a spot on the swing set. She had claimed her rightful place in the world, her courage shining brightly for everyone to see. This story isn't just about a playground or a single act of injustice. It's a reflection of how small actions, whether kind or cruel, can ripple outward, shaping lives and communities. Michelle's fall from grace served as a harsh lesson, but it also paved the way for change. And the little girl, with her quiet strength and unwavering spirit, reminded everyone that no one deserves to be pushed aside or ignored. If this story moved you, made you think, or sparked a desire to be better, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep spreading stories that inspire change and remind us of the importance of standing up for what's right. Together, we can build a world where every playground, and every space, is a place of inclusion and joy.